Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell. On Monday, Russia's defense ministry announced that the Russian Navy had recently completed a successful test launch of a Zircon hypersonic cruise missile from one of its ships and provided video footage of the test. This news was received in the US as per usual when it comes to just about any Russian military activity. The Pentagon's press secretary, John Kirby, had this to say, quote, "It's important to note that Russia's new hypersonic missiles are potentially destabilizing and pose significant risks because they are nuclear capable systems," unquote. He added, quote, "By contrast, the United States is developing solely non-nuclear hypersonic strike capabilities. So alongside our NATO allies, we remain committed to deterrence while promoting greater stability in the region," unquote. In the US, mainstream media reports on the test essentially parroted the Pentagon's response, framing Russia's successful launch as yet another chest-pounding military provocation aimed at the US and its NATO allies, and intended, as always, to further destabilize the region in the name of Russian hegemony. That Russia is developing and testing hypersonic weapons in order to deter continual and steadily increasing US and NATO aggression, to avoid destabilization, especially after a British naval ship tried to flex its muscles in the Black Sea in June while NATO carried out its Sea Breeze 2021 exercises. This is not even treated as a possibility in US mainstream media narratives. Here with us today to break all this down is Morgan Artyukhina, an activist and a writer at Sputnik. Morgan, thanks again for joining us on the show.
My pleasure. Always glad to come on.
So let's start with basics, if you will. What is a hypersonic weapon?
So a hypersonic just means it goes faster than Mach 5. So if it goes faster than, like, each Mach is the speed of sound. So when something is supersonic, that means it's going faster than sound moves through that medium. And in air, at about sea level, that's about 750 miles per hour. So that times 5, is about where Mach 5 is. And that's very fast. That's faster than most weapons, than all aircraft travel. It's much faster than a bullet goes. It's very quick, indeed. So that's kind of the rawest definition of what a hypersonic weapon is it's just a missile that goes very, very fast.
And both the US and Russia have been developing these. And as I alluded to in the intro, Russia recently successfully tested one. And supposedly the US has been trying to test theirs, but they've been coming up duds. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, so Russia actually has 2 operational hypersonic weapons, the Avant-Garde, which is fired like an ICBM, and the Kinzhal, which is an air-launched ballistic missile with hypersonic capability. It's a type of cruise missile. And the one that they tested a couple of days ago is called Zircon, which is an anti-ship missile. It'll be launched from ships. Could also potentially be launched from the surface, I guess, since that's pretty similar. So they have a third one in development, and they've been testing it for a couple of years. The US has no operational hypersonic weapons. It has 2 in development right now, which, as you alluded to, neither of which have actually been fired successfully. The response weapon, or Arrow, is they tried to fire it back in late March or early April, I forget, and it's carried by the B-52 bomber, which is a big hulking Vietnam era, nuclear bomber, and because it's very big, and they're also struggling to keep the B-52 relevant, but it wouldn't fire, it wouldn't detach from the aircraft, so it didn't fly. There's another one, I think it's called the hypersonic air-breathing weapon, which is kind of in parallel development, but is further behind. And that one is a slightly different design, but it's the same basic concept. And then there's also China. China has at least one possibly as many as 3 hypersonic weapons developed. They're a lot less open about what they've done than the Russians are. But we know that they have at least one because they have paraded it, on parade. And there have been bomber aircraft that have been spotted carrying extremely large missiles, which could be regular ballistic missiles, but is because the Chinese use air-launched ballistic missiles, which kind of a unique design. But it could also be a hypersonic weapon, and we think it was a hypersonic weapon based on kind of the shape of it and stuff. So that's kind of the lowdown on like who's got what. Nobody else has hypersonic weapons. It's just China and Russia right now, and the U.S. is playing catch up, and that's honestly why they're so scared of it.
And to get a little bit into the engineering of hypersonic weapons, can you talk about how they differ from regular missiles per se?
Sure. So actually, the thing is that we've had hypersonic weapons for a long time. They just haven't been called that. Every ballistic missile has to reach hypersonic speeds and go much, much faster in order to escape the Earth's gravity. It has to hit usually probably around 20 times the speed of sound to really escape the Earth's, gravitational well around it. So we've already had missiles that go very, very fast. But when you fire a ballistic missile, of course, it goes up and then kind of slowly curves off so that it can, go into an orbit around the Earth. And they go, straight up for a while, and they kind of, do that kind of thing. And if it's a weapon, then when it's up high is when it detaches that part, and then it will kind of keep going and then come down, and then this part falls away, and then this part, is the weapon, which will come down and strike its target, and it'll have to re-enter. And so, I mean, they can get going pretty fast, but they have a pretty, it's called a ballistic missile because it follows a ballistic trajectory. It's the same trajectory, mathematically speaking, as if you fired a bullet up in the air. So that's a ballistic trajectory. But a hypersonic weapon works a little bit differently in that instead of going way up out of the atmosphere and then coming back down again, it has a kind of much more depressed thing. So all that energy that would have been put into going up out of the atmosphere is now put into going horizontal, more or less, across land. And so the way that most hypersonic weapons work is the rocket engine will fire for a certain period of time and then lift it up, but not nearly as long as a ballistic missile. Then it'll detach, and then there'll be what's called a hypersonic glide vehicle, which will use that tremendous speed it got from the rocket engine to fly extremely fast down through the atmosphere. And they're very maneuverable. They're not designed to just kind of, go. When a ballistic missile is launched, you can tell within a couple of seconds of its launch more or less where it's going. Like I said, it's like a mathematical relationship with a little bit of a margin of error because you can change their direction a little bit, but not really. Hypersonic weapons are designed to be very maneuverable, to make sudden and unpredictable movements, which is designed to, on the one hand, frustrate interceptor missiles, which would try to shoot it down, and also to keep the enemy confused as to what exactly its target is. So it has maneuvering little wing stabilizers and stuff on it that allow it to do that. It has an AI that makes random movements so that nobody knows what it's about to do, but it knows what its target is. So that's how they reach that tremendous speed, and that's why they're so dangerous too, because existing in space already, there's already a network of satellites that are specialized for looking for ballistic missile launches. There's a very unique signature when they launch, and because they have to fly so up in space, they produce an enormous amount of heat, and these sensors on these satellites orbiting the Earth can see that. They can see that against the Earth, they can see that against the coldness of space, and they can pick that out. But because a hypersonic weapon, the engine actually only fires for a short amount of time, and then the rest of it is an unpowered glider, it produces almost no heat for them to detect. So basically all of our existing networks of ballistic missile detection systems can't pinpoint, much less track, a hypersonic weapon after it's launched. So again, very, very dangerous, very effective. even if you were going to try and shoot it down, it's faster than most interceptor missiles are going to be. So it's a real game changer in that field.
And does the fact that hypersonic missiles fly at lower altitudes than traditional missiles, if you will, does that have to do with satellites not being able to detect them?
Yeah, that's part of it, is that they kind of get lost in the background noise of the Earth's surface, right? But the bigger part is that the satellites are specialized for looking for heat signatures from an enormous rocket engine, and from most of its flight, there is no rocket engine powering it. It's just gliding on its own momentum. So that's a problem. It's basically just a big metal hulk flying through the atmosphere at great speed. It's like trying to track a bullet.
So according to the U.S. Naval Institute, the U.S. has been working on creating hypersonic weapons, hypersonic missiles since the early 2000s. And so far, as we've said, they haven't been able to come up with anything successful. And as you mentioned, both Russia and China have developed successful hypersonic weapons. So I'm wondering if you can speak about the development timeline here, especially given how dangerous these missiles are, because as we know, the US posture toward Russia and China is always an offensive one that's packaged as taking a stance of deterrence. So given that the US has supposedly been pursuing this technology for 20 years now, is it in response to developments by Russia and China, or is it vice versa, or is it a mix of the two?
I mean, no doubt that there was a lot of technologies the US was interested in, and no doubt they didn't feel a lot of pressure after the end of the Cold War to develop them as fast as possible. I think the long timeline for developing the stealth aircraft like the F-35 and stuff is kind of a testament to that, right? For almost 20 years, the enemies that the US was squaring off with didn't even have air forces. You know, these were insurgent groups or terrorist organizations or, other groups or whatever, who were not, what the Pentagon calls a near peer competitor. And that's a big part of the impetus now, is that now that they see Russia and China as the enemy, that, these nations are trying to, challenge or get in the way of the US's domination of the world, from the US's perspective anyway. Now they have near peer competition, which means they're at the front lines, of the cutting edge of the development of new technologies, stealth aircraft, right? Russia unveiled a new stealth fighter yesterday, called the Checkmate, and hypersonic weapons and stealth, frigates and stuff. So there's all kinds of new technologies that they're developing and pushing for that. So I think the thing is, for a long time, the US was happy to treat hypersonics as like a experimental, demonstrator. They had a demonstrator that they tested a couple of times. But I think the thing is that they really wanted whatever hypersonic vehicle or weapon they developed, because they were looking at both. It was just kind of, what's the technology, in the same way of like developing like a jet engine, or something like that. And to be clear, people also want to use hypersonic technology for travel too. There's lots of plans to build like high supersonic or even hypersonic airliners. Right now they're only really planning about kind of like Concorde sized or smaller, almost like high-end commuter jets. But like the next step from that will hopefully be airliners. So they're looking at that too. That would cut a trip from Tokyo to Los Angeles into like 2 hours. So I mean, there's enormous potential here in many fields, civilian and military. But I think the US really wanted their hypersonic vehicle to be driven by what's called a ramjet or a scramjet, which is a type of air-breathing engine that is kind of like a super duper jet engine. So a rocket engine actually doesn't work like a jet engine. It burns either liquid or solid fuel, and it's all kind of directed downward. in a chemical reaction downward. Whereas a jet engine, whether it's on, you know, an F-18 or on a 747, works similar. They work basically the same way. Air comes into the front, mixes with fuel, a lot like what happens in your car, and then is ignited and produces thrust out the back. And that's what pushes it forward. And so a scramjet and a ramjet, which are kind of very similar, basically are optimized for super fast travel. A jet engine really kind of has limits because the air that goes inside it has to be slowed down to subsonic speeds in order for the reaction to work right. Otherwise, it wouldn't operate at low speeds. You'd have to have two engines. You'd have to have an engine for going slow, taking off and landing and stuff, and then another engine that you turned on when you wanted to go super fast. And that's very expensive and very, very heavy. So they wanted a ramjet or a scramjet to work because that would give them enormous potential. They only begin to start becoming efficient around Mach 2, 3, 4. So they have to be going fast. Air has to be rammed into them at a supersonic speed, compressed to the point where it's so compressed that it, you know, wants to explode outward. And they've been pursuing that for a long time. Well, evidently the Chinese and the Russians said, we don't fucking care about scramjets or ramjets. We're just going to build a super fast fucking missile. And so that's what they did. And so there is also a scramjet hypersonic concept that I think Lockheed or DARPA is working on, which is, again, also kind of a long-term, like, we hope we can master this technology kind of thing. So yes, that's kind of the deal with that, with kind of the technological race. I think it's also important to mention that Russia and China have both for a long time looked to missiles as kind of a force balancer against the superior US military, because a missile is cheap and a missile, you can launch a whole bunch of them, and they're just as dangerous. You know, you can fire the missile or you can have an airplane that fires the missile or whatever. And so the Soviet Navy for many decades specialized in putting lots of missile launchers on their submarines and their frigates and even on their aircraft carriers so that they would be a potent threat to American aircraft and to the American Navy. And the Chinese have done the same, especially specializing in long-range anti-ship missiles, anti-naval missiles and stuff that are designed to keep the U.S. Navy well beyond an effective range from China's shores. So that is probably why they are ahead in terms of missiles on this, because they're actually ahead of the U.S. in terms of a lot of questions of missiles. So that's kind of what I think is behind that whole question.
And it seems to me that that's the unread or unspoken subtext behind a lot of the bellicosity we see from the US toward Russia and China. We often hear about the economic side of it, that China's stealing American technology, for example. But it seems that underneath that, the real worry for the power brokers here is the military technology. Would you agree with that?
I mean, anything that can challenge American power is always, you know, is always going to be a threat. But there's two things. There's one is is what they will wield, you know, but also there's what can they supply to other nations. And that's why laws like CATSA exist. You know, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which basically punishes nations for buying Russian or American or Iranian or North Korean technology by placing sanctions on them. And it's designed to keep, this is what happened with Turkey. For example, when Turkey bought S-400 air defense systems from Russia, the US didn't want them to do that, in part because they were worried about having the F-35 in close contact, and they were worried that, like, the Turks might get data about weaknesses on the F-35 and then give it to the Russians or to another customer. The Iranians have also been offered the S-400. China and India have bought S-400s and just told the US to shove it with their sanctions. Algeria has probably bought S-400s. So that's, you know, these are things that are broadly comparable to the best Patriot missile systems out there. So that's something the U.S. doesn't want other countries to have, because then they can defend themselves. Also, like the Su-35, which is an advanced jet fighter. Countries have been sanctioned for that, or threatened with sanctions. Most recently, Indonesia was kind of encouraged to go another route and actually wound up buying some Rafales from France instead. Or maybe they were Eurofighters. They bought jets from France, and then bought some lesser Russian aircraft. So they're also very worried about, the fact that these countries can supply advanced technology to other countries, which can then use them to defend themselves against America or American proxies, like Morocco, for example, the showdown between Morocco and Algeria, or I don't know, off the top of my head, missile systems in Syria that are shooting down Israeli missiles that are flying in or something, which aren't even S-400s. Those are older S-2 and 300s from the Cold War. But just the same, the point is made. These countries are able to defend themselves because they get technology from Russia and China, which are very much looking to export. They're looking to counter American predominance. The American arms industry is enormous. We sell most of the world weapons of some kind or another, and that's a huge part of the American economy now. And not just the defense contractors themselves, it's also the research bureaus at American land grant universities and stuff that are funded by these dollars too. So there's so much of the U.S. economy that has been tied into the war industry, and that war industry is threatened when, one, there's peace, or two, when somebody else is buying these weapons, and people are buying these weapons from somebody else rather, instead of from the United States.
Right. And this comes as the Biden administration is trying to, or already has sold or upgraded Jordan's fleet of F-16s. So that really points to the hypocrisy of the US in the sense that it's totally willing to arm and weaponize its preferred allies while railing against countries like Russia and China for, as you said, wanting to defend themselves, and then also developing the know-how to possibly share with other countries that want to remain outside the US's sphere of influence. So getting back to what the Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said about Russia and China having hypersonic weapons with nuclear capabilities, and the US developing hypersonic weapons solely without nuclear capabilities. Is there any truth to that?
Well, officially, yes. Let me try and find this article that I wrote. There have been hints that people have found that the US may be interested in developing a nuclear-capable hypersonic weapon. Officially, they say that they are not interested in it. But I can't imagine why they wouldn't be. I'm not really familiar with that exactly. Where is this story at? I mean, it is theoretically possible. It's a little bit like when they made the Aegis, what is it called? The Aegis Ashore system, and they put one in Romania, and it's supposed to be the it's like an anti-air, here we go. It's supposed to be an anti-air system like the Aegis air defense system on the US's Aegis cruisers. But Russia from the beginning pointed out this system is also capable of firing offensive missiles too. And at the time, offensive missiles with a range of greater than 500 miles and less than, I think, 3,000 miles were banned by the INF Treaty. And the Aegis system is used on American missile cruisers and destroyers to fire offensive missiles too, and they fire cruise missiles and stuff. They also use Aegis to do that. And so the Russians pointed out that this could be done. And all the Americans could kind of do is say, like, kind of, we pinky swear that we won't. This is only a defensive system. And here's the thing. We know that they were lying because within a month of the expiration of the INF treaty, after the US pulled out of it unilaterally in 2019, it expired on August 2nd, 2019. By September, the US had already converted the Aegis Ashore system in Romania to fire offensive missiles. It took them weeks to do that. Like within days of even getting rid of the INF treaty, the US was testing missiles that were banned by it. So it makes such a lie of their claim that Russia had been violating the treaty when they were clearly just itching to test new weapons. So here, let me give you this story that I wrote last summer. The title is U.S. Air Force May Have Accidentally Revealed Interest in Nuke-Armed Hypersonic Missiles. And this was based just on a request for information that the U.S. Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center accidentally made public on their beta.sam.gov public solicitation website for contracts, asking for companies to submit ideas in 7 different categories for potential upgrades to an ICBM, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile. But so this basically what this looks like, although the Defense Department vociferously denied it when asked about it, and also took down the request, by the way. They took it down as soon as a journalist asked them about it. So they realized what they had done. But they were looking at hypersonic upgrades to ballistic missiles. While a ballistic missile can carry a conventional warhead, the US only uses ballistic missiles for nuclear warheads. So if they were looking for a hypersonic upgrade to a nuclear missile, they're looking at a hypersonic nuclear missile. So they gave us no explanation. They deny, pulled down the evidence or whatever, but we got the receipts. So if that's what I mean when I say at the beginning, officially the US is not developing nuclear capable hypersonic weapons. In reality, I am absolutely sure that they are testing.
And it's worth mentioning that NASA has been using hypersonic technology for quite a while now, if I'm not mistaken, for re-entry capabilities for space aircraft. And they've also dovetailed that with Pentagon development of hypersonic weapons. So that speaks a little bit to the commercial aspect you mentioned earlier. So that commercial aspect has been in play. I don't know how long NASA has been using the technology, but it's been in play, and it seems like it's a snowball effect. And as we know, the US, once it gets a snowball effect going with regard to weaponry, it's pretty hard to stop, if not impossible. So that seems like what's happening here. And it seems like the US will eventually develop a hypersonic weapon of some sort. But when you look at the Government Accountability Office reports and summaries of the research and development going into hypersonic weapons, it seems like the US is in a sort of no man's land, if you will. There were so many looming questions, unanswered questions about what is the point of having these weapons, and what is it going to do with regard to geopolitical stability. And if I'm not mistaken, this year the Department of Defense requested $3.8 billion for research and development into hypersonic weapons, which is up from $3.2 billion from last year. So it does seem like they're going full steam ahead with this, even while issuing denials. And then another thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is that if you look at a map of NATO bases, they've basically created this curtain, if you will, their own iron curtain that moves right up to Russia's western border. You mentioned
And
Romania
southern border.
and southern border, correct? And you mentioned Romania earlier. That's one example. And then you also mentioned the INF Treaty, which the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from and essentially tore up. And then there are the 70 plus sanctions that the US has imposed on Russia. So I forget the official's position, and I'm forgetting his name, a Russian official, but he said, considering all of this, why is John Kirby, why is the Pentagon, why is the US press, which goes so dutifully along with what the Pentagon says, why are they surprised that we're developing and testing these weapons? So I know you talked about that a little bit already, but maybe we could go into more detail about just how hostile the US has been and is continuing to be toward Russia and allies like China.
Well, remember that when the Cold War ended, which the Cold War ended when the socialist governments in Eastern Europe were overthrown. They were overthrown by pro-U.S. forces, U.S.-supported forces. I mean, literally, Solidarność in Poland, the celebrated, union democracy movement, was literally funded by the CIA. And a lot of those countries obviously afterwards became NATO allies very quickly. And it's very interesting because Gorbachev, who was the last Soviet premier, was promised by then President George H.W. Bush that NATO, which was formed as ostensibly an anti-communist alliance of Western capitalist imperialist nations in 1949, would not expand eastward. That its role was basically now defunct because Russia was not a threat. The Soviet Union was gone, it dissolved into 15 different countries, and was, especially in the 1990s, not interested in, it was very much a defeated nation. It was not interested in confronting the West in any way. In fact, it cooperated in many ways up until well after, Putin became president in 1999, and after the war on terror, Russia was a very close cooperative because they were fighting the Chechen war. There were terrorist attacks in Moscow, and you remember the Breslan school hostage situation and all of that. So they were very much kind of on the same side. And yet, despite all of this, most of the former Warsaw Pact nations and many of the former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe are now part of NATO. And this was done by especially kind of ramping up the idea of Russia as a threat to small nations and stuff, especially the Baltic and whatever. And they didn't have the best relations. And that's for a variety of reasons, including, just to give one example, in Estonia, there was a Russian-speaking minority that was not allowed to come back to Russia because they weren't Russians, and was not given citizenship or really many rights in Estonia because they weren't Estonian speaking. They were Russians who had settled in Estonia and become kind of Estonianized, when it was part of the USSR. So there's been a very kind of hostile situation between them and their very similar situation to what's happening in Ukraine with Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And, Ukrainian nationalists say, well, you're Russians. And they say, no, we're Ukrainians, but we want to be treated like we're part of Ukraine. And obviously, were provoked into rebellion there by a nationalist fascist movement there, again, backed by the US, which is now trying to join NATO. And the US is really trying to fast track it, despite the fact that NATO has rules about how you have to be a democracy or whatever. And Ukraine is not. So, it's very interesting to see how their hand is shown even today in the negotiations and rhetoric around Ukraine, joining NATO, joining the EU, whatever, and how this has consistently been done by well, we're part of the West now, even down to like the consciousness. A lot of people who live in what they call Central Europe now deeply resent being put into a bucket with Eastern Europe. To them, Eastern Europe is where the barbarians are. Those are the Asiatic hordes, and we're civilized Europeans here in Slovakia and Poland, and stuff. So it's all very, very revanchist. You have very right-wing forces who came to power in those countries too. Attacked a lot of the progressive gains for women, LGBTQ people, and Romani and Jews and so many people. So it's all very kind of gone downhill that way. And so so now you have these countries that are U.S. allies on Russia's border to ostensibly contain her, such that when Russia moves troops around in her own borders, in her own fucking country, it's portrayed as a threat to other nations that Russia needs to explain or desist from because it's a threat to the peace. And yet, holding live fire drills with 30,000 troops in the Baltic states, flying bombers from, Dias all the way to Estonia to fire a missile, 20 miles from the Russian border, that's not provocative, right? That's not a threat to peace. But Russia moving brigades around in her own territory as part of normal drills, that's a threat of war. We almost had a war in Ukraine and Russia this past spring because of regular drills that Russian troops carried out in their own country, in the central southern region. So, which were portrayed as like prelude to an invasion in the hysterical Western press, which is always just foaming for another war at the mouth. So yeah, they no doubt they feel hemmed in. They look everywhere and they see a hostile world that treats them as a threat that needs to be contained. And they say, we thought we were your friends, right? China can say much the same thing, right? They thought they were the friends of the U.S. after the U.S. switched its recognition from Taiwan to, from Taipei to Beijing in 1978. Deng Xiaoping, market reforms really turned their backs on the USSR and, came into the American sphere, integrated themselves into into the world economy and the World Trade Organization and all of that, and really said, well, maybe if we play by the Western rules, they won't give us a hard time. And now, there is all this hostility, especially you talk about the technology transfers. They say it's technology theft and stuff. No, it's technology transfer. These companies that do business in China, they sign a deal to do business in China that says that they will share their technology with China, that they bring there. And that's a big part of how China has been able to develop so quickly, is that they have been able to legally get this technology. And now the U.S. is crying foul, claiming that China is stealing their technology and whatever. It's like, well, if you don't want China to have your technology, then don't try and, boost your bottom line by paying Chinese workers next to nothing, which is a little bit of kind of strangely common sense attitudes that Trump tapped into in a really nationalistic way when he was like, we're bringing jobs back from China and stuff. And it's like, if what you're upset about is what you say you're upset about, then that's kind of what you have to do. So that was part of that. But it's understandable that Russia and China would see enemies, around them and would look to each other for friendship, as they have, not just through the Shanghai organization, but, through their own bilateral deals, military cooperation, friendship, and so on. They're not allies, but they are aligned, broadly speaking. They have many of the same interests, and there are other countries that are seeing that bloc is more stable than the American-led bloc, which is war, divide and conquer, send in the American corporations and scoop up all the goods. That's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened in Afghanistan. And so you have countries like Pakistan and Iran and Vietnam and Malaysia, and that are looking to Russia and China and other countries too, Venezuela and Argentina to a certain extent, Algeria, that are not interested in kind of the U.S. way of doing things and are looking to them instead. So it's all kind of in a very interesting dynamic, but it's being driven by the fact that the U.S. insists on its right to run the world. And anything that gets in its way of doing that, another power that might rise up to, whether it has designs of domination or not, the U.S. is scared of that. And there is one final thing I want to say, which is that it's not all just geopolitics, it is ideology. The U.S. claims it's geopolitics, but back in January, the National Security Council, for some bizarre and unknown reason, released a classified version of their Indo-Pacific strategy report that was kind of their internalized thinking about drawing it up. They released the public document, I think, in 2018, maybe 2019, and then they released this strategy framework in January, 20 years before it was supposed to be declassified. And in that, if you read it, for Sputnik, I did a comparison of the two documents to see what did they want to say publicly versus what were they plainly, bluntly talking about when they were talking with each other in the National Security Council. And the NSC, it's very, very clear to them that this is an ideological thing. Their enemy is the Communist Party of China. They see this as a battle against socialism and a battle for their world system, for capitalism to be triumphant. And that's what they're afraid of. They're not afraid of China as a nation. They're afraid of Chinese socialism. They're afraid of an alternative to American-style capitalism, which always privileges America first. And they see that China's model of socialist development, of supporting indigenous development of other nations, of not interfering in their affairs, and allowing them to develop their own resources for their own benefit, and to cooperate internationally in ways that actually benefit them instead of ways that, only seem to benefit them but are actually siphoning their wealth away and their sovereignty away. That's what the U.S. is afraid of becoming popular.
Right. And if you look at Nikki Haley's Stand with America or Stand for America Foundation, which is essentially a think tank she started after her tenure as UN ambassador came to an end, there is an explicit policy objective of vehemently standing against communist China. And I think that really speaks to the ideological aspect you just mentioned. Like, communist is emphasized probably more than anything else with regard to China being a US enemy. It's their way their economic and social systems have been organized in non-hyper-capitalist fashion, I suppose you could say. But getting back to Ukraine and Crimea, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about what happened in the Black Sea recently, because it really seemed like just a blip on the news radar, but in reality, it was much more than that, and really was a provocation of sorts. Can you get into the details of that and how that pertains to what we've been talking about with the development of these hypersonic weapons?
So what happened in the Black Sea was you had this British Type 45 destroyer, the HMS Defender, which was, I think it had been in Odessa, which is a Ukrainian port city in Western Ukraine. And I think it was going to sail to Georgia or somewhere in the Eastern Black Sea. And to do that, you have to go around the Crimea, which is a peninsula that sticks kind of out into the Black Sea from the southern landmass of Ukraine. Now, in early 2014, Crimea declared independence from Ukraine. Crimea has an almost totally Russian-speaking population. There's about, I think, 10% of the population are Crimean Tatars. The rest of them are Russians. And Crimea was a part of Russia for a very long time. for hundreds of years. It was transferred to Ukraine while Ukraine was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the 1950s by Nikita Khrushchev as just kind of an administrative, easy administrative thing that he did. But the Russian population is still there. And after this coup in February 2014 in Kiev, when the fascists, the right-wing nationalists came to power, with U.S. backing, of course, these people were very, very anti-Russian. And not just anti-Russian, but anti-Russian speakers in their own country. And as I said, Ukraine used to be a part of the Soviet Union, of which Russia was also a part. And they have, again, been part of the same country for hundreds of years. And so there's a lot of Ukrainians who live in Russia, and there's a lot of Russians who live in Ukraine. And there's a lot of Russians and Ukrainians live in Kazakhstan too, by the way. These peoples have mingled and intermingled and scattered all across that entire region. And when the Soviets drew borders to create ethnic republics for all of the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union, to give them space to have their own cultures, so that they would not be facing forced assimilation by the larger Russian culture. So in Ukraine, they could speak the Ukrainian language, of administration. They could have Ukrainian culture, even practice, their own version of religion or whatever, without having to worry about like it disappearing and being replaced by Russian. So there is that, but there's also a lot of Russian speakers who live in Ukraine, and that's fine too, because there was also the Russian Republic for Russians, and whatever. So it wasn't a big deal that there were Russians living in Ukraine. Many people speak both languages, which are very, very similar. Like I speak Russian, and I can if I pay attention and look up a couple of words here and there, I can understand Ukrainian. So this nationalist government came to power, and they started passing laws that was going to make it get rid of all the other national languages except for Ukrainian. And so Russian speakers in Ukraine were very upset by this. And, there was a lot of really, really bad hostility, including the attack on the trade union office in Odessa, which was torched by fascists, and several dozen people burned to death in that. So basically push came to shove, and the Russian majority areas of Ukraine rebelled. And that's why you have the independent, people's republics in the Donbass region, the basin of the Donetsk River in the east, and Crimea declared independence. Crimea, a few days after it declared independence, they asked to accede to Russia, to join the Russian Federation. They held a referendum. The vast majority of people in Crimea voted to join Russia. This was mostly for their own defense, because they were not in a position to defend themselves from the Ukrainian military trying to retake them. But also because of this long-standing cultural affinity. So Crimea became a part of Russia. The West did not recognize this. They claimed that the referendum was cooked up by the Russians. They claimed that Russia had invaded Ukraine and conducted a land grab. And this was, new offensive, Putin going, imperialism and stuff. And used that as the excuse for the deployment of vast numbers of troops on the frontier. And a lot of the ramping up we've seen since 2014 and the decline in American-Russian relations since then has been a result of them, of basically how Russia benefited from the fact that the U.S. coup in Ukraine was a catastrophic failure, that it caused the dismemberment of the country because they put Nazis in charge. So fast forward to last month, and this warship, goes to sail through, and according to Britain, Crimea is a part of Ukraine, not Russia. So they went to sail through the waters and said, these are waters we're allowed in. Ukraine said we're allowed to travel in their water.
And there's a split in the territorial waters, if you want to call them that. There technically there's Ukrainian territorial waters and Russian territorial waters. Is that correct?
Yes, Ukraine has a coast on the Black Sea, and they, on both sides of Crimea, Mariupol's on one side, Odessa is on the other. And so there are very, very complex lanes of travel, who's allowed to do what, where, and all of that. But where the HMS Defender went was unquestionably Russian. The only reason they said it was Ukrainian was because they don't recognize that that Crimea is a part of Russia. They claim it's a part of Ukraine. So they sailed through. The Russians said, "You're sailing through our territory. Like, you're sailing within 10 miles of our shoreline. That's a violation of our territory." And so they sent out ships to head it off and warn them off. They sent out aircraft to intimidate them and really warn them off. And Britain rather hilariously denied that any of this had happened. And then the Russians released all the video.
Mm-hmm.
And the transponder on the British frigate shows that it did go within 12 miles of the shoreline, which is where territorial waters are. Everything hinges on the fact that Boris Johnson doesn't think that doesn't think that Crimea is part of Russia. I think that's part of Ukraine. So that's a good example of how these stupid claims can become a shooting war, and so it was very, very provocative what they did. And they tried to pretend that it wasn't, that it was Russian aggression. And I think this is a great example of this kind of thing. This is Russian territory within 10 miles of the Russian shoreline. Imagine how the United States would behave if a Russian frigate were to sail 10 miles from Hawaii, imagine, even a better example, imagine if a Russian destroyer was to sail through the Puget Sound, okay? And was to say, "Oh, no, we recognize Puget Sound and the Bay Area there as Canadian territory, and the Canadians said we could go there." Okay, that's how absurd this incident is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what happened. And then Russia put its forces in Crimea and in the southern district on alert. Really kind of activated to say, look, if you want to be stupid, you can be stupid, but we are not going to violate our territory unimpeded. And it actually reminds me, there was another incident last fall that the United States did, where they also entered Russian territorial waters in the Far East, in the Sea of Japan. There's a little part of the Sea of Japan, called Peter the Great Gulf. And that's the waterway that leads to Vladivostok, which is the main Russian port in the east. And the Americans called it a freedom of navigation operation, which is a deliberately provocative thing the Department of State came up with, where it sends warships around to deliberately sail through, flout what they call excessive maritime claims by other nations, just to make the point. And there's actually a list the Department of State has of all of the maritime claims that the U.S. disputes. And they dispute these based on rules that are part of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, as you'll kind of see that acronym sometimes. And so the U.S. says it's enforcing international law, blah, blah, blah. The problem with that is, of course, that the U.S. has never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, so it doesn't recognize, legally speaking, that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is law, and yet it claims the right to enforce it around the world as a global policeman. So in this incident in the Peter the Great Gulf, I think it was in November, maybe early December, U.S. warship sailed in, and a Russian warship went up and sailed very close to it and chased it out. Very strong protest, and stuff. So, they've been doing this a lot to Russia. They do it a lot to China too, in the South China Sea. They also do it to Vietnam in the South China Sea. Increasingly, they've been going after Vietnam's claims too. They have their list. They've done phone ops to Venezuela before too, concerning some of their offshore islands and stuff. So it's a tool the U.S. uses to just kind of beat its chest, basically, and claim that they are this, like I said, global policeman.
So when you have a British ship, as recently happened in the Black Sea, sailing 12 miles off the coast of Russia,
10
and
miles.
10 miles, and Boris Johnson claiming that the UK doesn't recognize those waters as belonging to Russia. How much of that do you think is on purpose on the part of, let's say, the British in this case? Because they could easily, even if they don't recognize Crimea as Russian, they could still abide by the territorial water divide if they wanted to.
This was a deliberate decision by them.
Right.
They
That's
knew
what I
that
wanted
they were
to
going to
ask
cause
you.
a hubbub, and they did it. And they wanted to see what Russia would do.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to make the point. That's the thing. It's all about making the point of deliberately flouting for all the world. We don't recognize. It's to make a little bit of kind of a like a leap, but I think it's the same broad logic. It's how people will deliberately misgender trans people.
Mm-hmm.
They will do it not because they're incapable of calling them the right way. It's to demonstrate their contempt for the other person's claim, for the other person's position. So it's the same attitude. It's the British wanted to demonstrate their contempt for Russia, and it gives it. I mean, it was a PR coup. I mean, most of it was. I mean, the Russians embarrassed them internationally, but for the British public, I'm sure the British public walked away with this attitude that, like, the Russians were a threat. The Russians were aggressive. They attacked our innocent ship.
Right.
So that's really what it is. It's just posturing. This is just all posturing on an international stage.
Right. But as we've seen with history, posturing can very quickly escalate into war. And as we've been discussing, Russia has plenty of experience with not just war, but provocations by these mostly, or maybe even entirely, Western powers. And so it's no surprise, sort of coming full circle here, that they would want to develop hypersonic weapons, though given the capabilities of those weapons, they wouldn't fire them into the Black Sea, being that close to Russia. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not even sure that those weapons could be deployed over such a short range. But at the same time, this happened with the British ship. There were, as I mentioned, when we were getting started, the NATO was carrying out its Sea Breeze 2021 exercises. What are those exactly?
Just huge maritime drills they hold in the Black Sea. The U.S. hosts them. They invite dozens of other nations. So Ukraine takes part, but also, like, I don't know who else was there. Romania, Israel, Tunisia, Britain, obviously, the Netherlands. They all send their ships there and their aircraft there, and they just, drill and they practice. I mean, they're war games. It's what it is. It's a variety of war games that they play. Obviously deliberately staged, as a message to Russia. As all war games are. The U.S. holds war games off the coast of Iran. It holds war games off the coast of China in the South China Sea. They hold war games in the Baltic. They don't hold them off the coast of France.
Mm-hmm.
They don't hold them off the coast of Canada, off the coast of the United States. They do it off of other shores. So that's all it is.
Right. And just getting back to the hypersonic weaponry, where would you say, based on your reporting and your research, do things stand right now? We talked a little bit in the beginning about the US being behind and the capabilities being more developed and advanced in Russia and China. Where do things stand, but where and I'm not asking you to make a solid prediction here, but where do you see this going? This competition, if you will, although Russia and China aren't approaching it so much as a competition as they are in the name of defense, self-defense. But where do you think this is going to lead to? Or what do you think this is going to lead to?
Well, another arms race for sure. Money being poured into the defense budget. As you talked about, they're increasing it every year. Donald Trump, I think in 2019, declared it, I don't know if he called it a national emergency, but he issued some special declaration that actually it was in 2020 because he used the Defense Production Act to do it, to mandate the production or prioritization of certain special materials for hypersonic weapons and things, to jumpstart that. So it's something that they are taking seriously, and I mean, it's just a new weapon, you know. I think it will be. It's just a piece in a much larger chess game, but. I mean, they're already looking into defense systems. The U.S. is trying to test its SM-6, Standard Missile 6, as an anti-hypersonic weapon. The Russians are testing the S-500 Prometheus air defense system as an anti-hypersonic weapon. So there's, I think it's just another technology that's going to just continue to drive military-industrial complex. It's going to continue to drive international relations southward. That's a confusing expression when talking about geopolitics. It's going to make them worse, and I mean, that's what it is. It's just another part of the calculus.
Right, and it's worth noting that the current U.S. President Joe Biden was one of, if not the primary architect of the so-called democratic coup in Ukraine in 2014.
Yes,
and right, and Jen Psaki recently came out and confirmed that the US did in fact deliver an aid package, I think both lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine, and that included Javelin missiles, for example. So point being that the US has no problem supplying its proxies with lethal aid to ostensibly defend themselves from Russian aggression. And it is a boon for the defense industry. I know both Raytheon and Lockheed are involved in developing these hypersonic weapons. So yeah, I think you make a good point that it's only going to escalate into an arms race if it's not one already, and it's going to make the international relations, the relations between the US and Russia and China and its allies much worse. So I've kept you long enough, and I think we've gotten into detail about this new weaponry and the dangers it poses. And I really appreciate your time, Morgan. Our guest today has been Morgan Artyukhina. They write regularly for Sputnik, and you can find their pieces online very easily. And where can people find you on Twitter?
They can follow me at Lavender N Red, and letter N.
Okay, and you're quite active on there, and you post your pieces on there very frequently. So do follow Morgan on there if you can. And once again, Morgan, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.